here from 1948 is the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the General Assembly. This is a document that's often cited by people who talk about these sorts of things, and rightly so, because listen to this, right? The General Assembly proclaims this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual and every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures, national and international, to secure their universal and effective recognition and observance, both among the peoples of member states themselves and among the peoples of territories under their jurisdiction. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Okay, now we're noticing this progression, right? From the Declaration of Independence to the Declaration of the Rights of Man to this UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is this idea. I mean, human rights, right, are an attempt to do what Burke is talking about, to pluck these kind of universal, eternal truths that apply for everyone, everywhere, in all times and places. But note what they do. Born free and equal in dignity and rights. It's very Rousseauian, but it adds this dignity idea that you're not just given something, you are dignus, you are worthy of it. You are somehow, and therefore, of course, your rights are a sign of your dignity. And this is why, right, it's not just bad to take somebody's rights away, but it's an affront, right? It's an affront to me if it won't let gay people get married. It's an affront, right? This is where we start to get offended and emotional all the time, right? It's because dignity has this inherent concept that it's a slap in the face when somebody disagrees about what you have a right to, right? They are endowed with reason and conscience. Endowed by whom? We're not told, right? And should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Well, as I said last week, brothers have one father, right? Who's that? Who's the father? So all of this language, right, is shot through with religious reasoning, but refuses to acknowledge that religious reasoning. And in fact, one of the rights, right, is the right to choose your own religion, which again, I defend that right up to a point, right? I do think that you should be free to believe what you believe. I don't think you should therefore be free to call anything a religion, right, and get protections for like the Church of Satan or the Flying Spaghetti Monster. But yes, I think you should have freedom of religion. But note that all of this language, every word of this language, rights, endowed, brotherhood, right? Every word in this text comes freighted with theological history and doesn't make any sense without the theological history. It makes no sense to talk about the brotherhood of man unless man has a common father. It makes no sense to talk about endowed with reason and conscience unless somebody's doing the endowing. It makes no sense to talk about being born free unless somebody declares that you are free, because as we have seen, of course, there is no certainty among the common mass of humanity that all men are born free. And the only person who has the authority to declare you free in a way that nobody can ever revoke is God. If you give that authority to government, they are going to end up deciding whether you are really dignus or not, whether you are really worthy of the dignity of the rights that you are given. And that, my friends, is how we end up in a purely secular world of rights. That is how we end up with pursuits of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that ultimately end up in dystopian horror, because they have completely forgotten. Not only have they forgotten where the language comes from, but they're using words that in the very structure of their syllables, right, harkens back to the necessity of understanding them in a theological context. And that those very words, though, are now divorced from their theological context by people who deny that context matters and don't understand where it came from or why, right? And that, when you do that, you have literally written yourself a recipe for madness. You have cut the ground underneath yourself, even while you attempt to persist, to keep walking in midair. And as we know from the cartoons, when Wile E. Coyote runs off the cliff, he can stay in midair for a while, but eventually he plummets to the ground. And this is why this is happening, right? Now you understand. And now I hope you will understand that if you feel inclined to say, well, all this stuff can come without God, right? I defy you to show me how, right? I would happily say to you, like, oh, sure, like, go do whatever you want, right? I'm not trying here to, like, make you feel bad about not being able to believe or whatever. What I'm trying to do is show you that this is the tradition that you've got. And if you want that tradition, you have to at least understand that God is not erasable from it, that he's not an option in this whole history of logic. And once you take God away, you end up speaking complete gibberish and nonsense without even knowing. Nobody who wrote this declaration thought he was saying anything but the most elevated and dignified They thought this was a great gift to humanity. And yet, of course, they're speaking nonsense. Endowed, dignity, brotherhood, rights, all of these words make no sense in the context that they are trying to give it, which is a secularist context.